If you want to see how quickly a room can forget you exist, stand where no one is meant to look. Clara Whitmore learned that before the orchestra finished its first waltz, kneeling on polished marble that reflected chandeliers worth more than her entire life. Her skirts gathered tight, so they would not brush against the passing hems of silk gowns. Her fingers moving with quiet precision as she stitched a torn seam that was never supposed to be hers to fix, the thread pulled taut between. Then intent, crossing the ballroom with a rhythm that did not match the music and yet somehow replaced it. And people moved, not dramatically, just enough, a fraction of a step, a slight turn of the shoulder, pathways opening where none had been before, and Clara's fingers slowed, just for a second, the thread catching slightly against the fabric as something in the silence pressed closer, heavier, until even the sound of her own breathing felt too loud for the space. And then there was the smallest pause, not around her, but near her, close enough that she could feel the absence of movement, the way one notices when a breeze stops unexpectedly, and her hand stilled entirely, the needle suspended midair, the thread drawn tight between her fingers, and in that suspended second, the world seemed to narrow, to compress into a single fragile point where everything could shift without warning, and she knew, without knowing how she knew, that someone was standing in front of her, not beside, not behind, directly in front, where no one had stood all evening, where no one was meant to stand, and still she did not look up, not immediately, because looking up meant being seen, and being seen meant being measured, and she had already been measured more times than she could count, always coming up lacking in ways that were politely ignored but never forgotten. But the silence held, longer than it should have, longer than courtesy allowed, and slowly, carefully, Clara lifted her gaze, just enough to see the line of a dark coat, the polished edge of a boot inches from her skirt, and higher, the stillness of a man who had not yet spoken but had already altered the room simply by choosing where to stand, and for a brief, impossible moment, everything else disappeared, the music, the voices, the careful arrangement of society itself, leaving only that space between them, thin as thread, tight as breath, waiting to break. She should have lowered her eyes again. That was the rule. That was always the rule. But something in the stillness in front of her made that impossible. Not fear, not exactly. Something sharper, something that held her in place as surely as if a hand had closed around her shoulder and told her not to move. And so she looked, fully this time, her gaze lifting past the clean line of his coat, past the silver button that caught the chandelier light without reflecting it, to the face above it. And for a second, she forgot the thread still looped around her finger, forgot the unfinished seam in her lap, forgot the dozens of watching eyes she could feel beginning to turn toward them like a tide slowly shifting direction, because the man standing in front of her did not look at her the way men usually did when they noticed her at all. There was no dismissal in it, no quick calculation followed by disinterest. His attention was steady, precise, as if he had already decided she was worth the time it took to see her clearly. And that alone was enough to unsettle something she had spent years keeping carefully contained. Her fingers tightened instinctively, the thread pulling too taut, biting lightly into her skin, and she became aware again of where. With it came the familiar instinct to step back, to remove herself before she became the center of something she could not control. Her hand moved slightly, just enough to indicate she was about to retreat. But before she could take even a single step, his hand lifted, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to interrupt the motion. And though he did not touch her, the gesture itself was enough to stop her completely. Her breath caught, not sharply, just enough to remind her she had been breathing too quietly for too long. And for a second they remained like that, suspended, her half turned away, him standing directly in her path. And then, from somewhere to the left, a voice broke through, soft but edged with urgency. "Clara," it said, her name spoken in that careful tone reserved for correcting mistakes before they became visible. She recognized it immediately, her aunt's voice, controlled, composed, but carrying the unmistakable pressure of expectation. Clara did not look away from the man in front of her, not yet, but she felt the weight of that voice settle against her shoulders, reminding her of exactly who she was in this room and exactly what she was meant to be doing. She turned then, just enough to acknowledge it, her posture aligning with the role she had been given. "Yes," she said quietly, The word measured, unobtrusive, and when she looked back, she expected to find that the moment had passed, that he would have stepped away, that the brief and strange focus of his attention had already shifted elsewhere. But he was still there, still watching her with that same calm, deliberate focus, as if the interruption had not altered anything at all. And now the room was no longer pretending not to notice. Heads had turned, conversations had thinned into fragments, and the line of young women at the far end stood just a little straighter, their carefully arranged composure tightening under the strain of uncertainty. Clara felt the shift in the room as clearly as if it had brushed against her skin, and for the first time that evening, she understood that she was no longer invisible, and that realization settled into her chest with a quiet, steady weight that was not entirely fear, because fear would have told her to leave immediately, to step back and lower her gaze and restore the balance that had been disturbed. But something else held her there, something that felt dangerously close to being seen, and she did not know what to do with that. Not here, not now, not under the gaze of a man who had not yet spoken a single word and had already changed the way the entire room was breathing. The silence did not break when her aunt spoke. It only shifted, tightening around Clara like a thread pulled too far, and for a moment no one moved. Not the musicians waiting with their bows suspended midair, not the line of young women standing with smiles that had begun to falter at the edges, not even the servants along the walls who had learned to become invisible long before she had. And at the center of it all stood the man who had not yet given the room permission to breathe again. Clara felt it then, the full weight of his attention, not heavy, not pressing, but exact, as if he had narrowed the entire ballroom down to a single point and placed her inside it. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the faint sting from the thread still there, grounding her in a way she was suddenly grateful for, because everything else felt uncertain, unstable, like the moment before a glass slips from a hand and no one is sure whether it will shatter or be caught. She should have stepped back. That was the correct response, the expected response. She could feel it in the way her aunt's gaze sharpened from across the room, in the subtle shift of bodies that suggested people were preparing to restore the order that had been disrupted. But Clara did not move, not yet, because the man in front of her still had not moved, and something in that stillness held her in place more effectively than any command could have. Then, slowly, deliberately, he took a single step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to redefine it, the distance between them narrowing in a way that made the air feel different, thinner, and Clara felt her breath adjust without her permission, a quiet inhale that she could not quite suppress. His gaze did not waver. Not to the side, not toward the others who were now openly watching. It remained fixed on her with a calm intensity that made everything else feel secondary, and behind him, the room began to react in small, controlled ways, a fan closing with a soft snap, a whispered exchange cut short before it could become noticeable, the faint rustle of silk as someone shifted their weight, each sound contained, restrained. But together they formed a kind of pressure that built steadily. Clara became aware of how exposed she was standing there, how every detail of her appearance would be measured now. The slight wear at the edge of her gloves, the simplicity of her dress compared to the others, the fact that she had been kneeling on the floor moments ago, and yet none of that seemed to matter to him, or if it did, he did not show it, and that absence of dismissal was more disorienting than any criticism would have been. Her hand moved again, this time not to retreat, but to steady herself, fingers brushing lightly against the fabric she had set aside, as if confirming it was still there, still real, still something she understood. And then, without warning, he reached out, the movement precise, controlled, and for a fraction of a second the entire room seemed to freeze around it, every eye tracking the line of his arm as his gloved hand closed gently around her wrist, not forceful, not abrupt, just firm enough to stop her from moving at all. Clara's breath caught, sharper this time. The contact unexpected, undeniable, and for a moment she could not think, could not recall the rules she had spent years memorizing, because none of them accounted for this. For a man like him choosing to touch her in the middle of a ballroom where every gesture carried weight, his grip was steady, not possessive, not careless, simply certain, and that certainty sent a ripple through the room that no one could pretend not to feel. Her aunt stepped forward then, quicker than before, her voice following a half step behind, controlled but edged with urgency that had begun to slip. "Your Grace," she said, the title landing in the air like a stone dropped into still water, and in that instant, the identity Clara had not yet named settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Duke Adrian Blackwell, the man every conversation in that room had been quietly orbiting, the man who had not looked at any of them, was now standing directly in front of her, holding her wrist as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara felt the shift inside herself as sharply as she felt the pressure of his hand. Not fear, not exactly, something deeper, something that told her this moment would not be undone. No matter what happened next, the Duke did not release her when her aunt spoke. He did not even glance in that direction immediately. His attention remained on Clara for one beat longer than courtesy required, as if confirming something only he could see. And then, slowly, he turned his head, just enough to acknowledge the interruption, the movement minimal but decisive, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying easily without needing to rise. "Is she spoken for?" he asked, the question simple, almost casual, and yet it cut through the room with a precision that left no space for misunderstanding. Clara felt the words settle around her, felt the way the air seemed to tighten again, this time not with uncertainty, but with anticipation, because this was no longer a moment that could be ignored or corrected quietly. This was a line being drawn, and she was standing directly on it. No one answered him immediately, and that was the first fracture, not loud, not visible in any dramatic sense, but precise, like a fine crack running through polished glass that only became apparent when the light shifted just enough to reveal it. Clara felt it ripple outward from the question, the way conversations collapsed mid-sentence, the way a fan paused halfway to closing, the way even the musicians seemed to forget the next note they were meant to play. Her aunt was the first to recover, as she always was, stepping forward with a controlled urgency that sharpened her posture, her gloved hand lifting slightly, as if to reclaim the space Clara had somehow occupied. "Your Grace," she said again, this time with a faint smile that did not quite reach. Her eyes, there must be some misunderstanding. Her gaze flicked briefly to Clara, not long enough to acknowledge her as a person, only long enough to reassign her as a problem that needed correcting. "My niece is not part of the presentation this evening." The words were careful, polished, but underneath them ran something harder, a quiet insistence that the order of the room could still be restored if handled properly. Clara felt the shift in pressure as her aunt's presence drew closer, the familiar pull of expectation tightening around her shoulders, telling her without words to step back, to lower her gaze, to disappear before this became something irreversible. Her instinct answered immediately, her body beginning to turn, her wrist moving slightly in the Duke's grasp as she prepared to withdraw, but his hand did not release her, not even when she moved. Instead, his grip adjusted, subtly, just enough to hold her in place without appearing to do so. And that small correction, that quiet refusal to let her retreat, was enough to still her completely. Her breath caught again, not sharp this time, but steady, as if her body had decided that struggling against something so certain would only draw more attention. And around them the room leaned in, not physically, not in any obvious way, but in the way attention narrows, focusing, concentrating, until every detail becomes sharper, clearer, more defined. Clara could feel it in the way the air seemed to press closer in, the way the distance between people felt reduced without anyone taking a step. And still he did not let go. The Duke's gaze shifted then, finally moving from her to her aunt, but the movement was measured, controlled, as if he had decided the order in which he would acknowledge the room, and was now simply following through. "I did not ask if she was presented," he said, his voice calm, even, carrying without effort. And for a moment the distinction seemed small, almost insignificant, until it settled, until its meaning became clear, and when it did, it landed with a weight that no one could ignore. Clara felt it as surely as if it had been placed directly in her hands, the difference between being part of a list and being chosen outside of it. Her aunt's smile tightened, just slightly, the first visible crack in her composure. "She has no engagement," she replied quickly, as if correcting the situation could still bring it back under control. "But she is not." She stopped herself, the word unspoken but present in the air, not suitable, not appropriate, not meant for this. And in that pause, that hesitation, the truth of Clara's position was laid bare more clearly than any direct statement could have achieved. Clara felt the heat rise faintly at the back of her neck, not from shame exactly, but from the sudden clarity of being defined in front of so many people, reduced to the absence of something she had never been given the chance to possess. And still his hand remained steady around her wrist, unchanging, unaffected by the shifting currents around them. Then he moved, not away, not releasing her, but stepping slightly to the side, a small adjustment that placed her more fully in view of the room. The motion deliberate, unmistakable, and for a brief second everything seemed to freeze again. The angle of their bodies, the line of his arm, the way she stood beside him instead of behind or apart. And in that stillness the balance of the room shifted, not completely, not yet, but enough to be felt, enough to unsettle the careful arrangement that had existed moments before. Clara became acutely aware of her posture, of the way she held herself, of the fact that she was no longer at the edge of anything. She was in the center now, whether she wanted to be or not. Her fingers relaxed slightly at her sides, the earlier tension easing just enough to allow her to stand without appearing to brace against something unseen. And for the first time since he had stopped in front of her, she felt a strange and unfamiliar steadiness begin to form beneath the uncertainty. Not confidence, not yet, but something that suggested she did not need to retreat to survive this moment, because he had not stepped back, and as long as he remained where he was, the room would have to adjust around that fact, not the other way around. Her aunt saw it then, Clara could tell by the way her expression shifted, the calculation returning, sharper, more focused. "Your Grace," she said again, her tone softer now, more persuasive. "There are many young ladies here who would be honored." "I am aware," he interrupted, not raising his voice, not needing to. And the interruption landed cleanly, without hesitation, without apology, cutting across her words as if they had never been intended to finish. And in that moment, the power dynamic that had governed the entire evening tilted, not dramatically, not with any outward display, but with a precision that left no room for doubt. Clara felt it settle, that quiet shift, the realization that the rules of the room were no longer being followed in the way everyone had expected, and that she, somehow, impossibly, was at the center of that change. The Duke's hand finally loosened slightly around her wrist, not releasing her entirely, but easing just enough to allow her to move if she chose to. And for a second she considered it. The option to step away still there, still possible. But she did not take it. She remained where she was, standing beside him in the middle of a ballroom that no longer knew how to pretend she was not there. And that, more than anything he had said or done, changed everything. The room did not recover. It adjusted, and that was worse, because adjustment meant acceptance, and acceptance meant that what was happening could no longer be dismissed as a mistake. Clara felt it in the way the silence reshaped itself into something deliberate, something watching. The kind of quiet that follows when everyone realizes they are witnessing a moment that will be repeated later in drawing rooms and whispered behind gloved hands. Her aunt stepped closer, the movement smooth but urgent beneath its surface, her hand reaching for Clara's elbow with a familiarity that had always meant correction, redirection, removal. But this time the distance did not close the way it should have, because the Duke shifted before she could touch her, not abruptly, not defensively, simply placing himself half a step between them, a subtle reorientation of his body that redirected the line of approach without appearing to block it. And in that small adjustment, the space around Clara changed again, no longer open for correction, no longer accessible in the same way it had been moments before. Her aunt's hand paused in midair, fingers still extended, and for a brief second everything seemed to hold. The gesture suspended, unfinished, as if the room itself had forgotten how it was supposed to continue. Then her hand lowered, slowly, controlled, the smile returning to her face with a precision that suggested effort, rather than ease. "Your Grace," she said, softer now, recalibrated. "You honor us with your attention, but surely you would prefer a more suitable introduction." The words settled carefully into place, not emphasized, not repeated, but present, and Clara felt it land, felt the familiar weight of it pressing against her shoulders. reminding her of all the ways she had been measured and found lacking without ever being told directly. She did not look away, not this time. Her gaze remained steady, not challenging, not defiant, simply present, and that alone felt like a shift she did not fully understand. The Duke did not respond immediately, his attention returning to Clara with that same deliberate focus, as if the conversation around them was secondary, as if the question of suitability had already been answered in a way no one else had yet recognized. His hand, still lightly holding her wrist, adjusted again, not tightening, not restraining, but turning her slightly toward him. The motion controlled, unmistakable, and for a fraction of a second the room froze around it, the angle of her body changing, her position aligning with his in a way that made it impossible to pretend she was incidental to this moment. Clara felt the shift in her balance, the way her weight settled differently on her feet, the way her shoulders straightened without conscious effort, and with it came a clarity she had not expected. Not confidence, not yet, but an awareness that she was no longer being moved by the expectations of others. She was being placed, deliberately, by someone who had the authority to make that placement matter. Behind them, a low murmur began to build, contained but persistent, the sound of a room recalculating itself in real time. And then another voice entered, sharper, less controlled. "This is highly irregular," it said, the speaker stepping forward from the line of guests, a woman with posture as precise as her tone, her gaze moving between Clara and the Duke with a mixture of disbelief and careful restraint. "Your Grace, the selection has been arranged with great care." Her words were formal, respectful, but edged with something harder, a quiet insistence that the structure of the evening should not be undone by a moment of personal interest. Clara felt the pressure of that gaze, sharper than the others, more direct, and for a second the instinct to retreat returned, rising quickly, urging her to step back before this became something she could not withstand. Her fingers shifted slightly at her sides, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but enough to signal the beginning of withdrawal, and then his hand moved again, not holding her in place this time, but lifting her hand just slightly, just enough to interrupt the motion, the gesture precise, controlled, and in that suspended second, everything seemed to narrow, the movement isolated against the stillness of the room, her hand in his, raised just enough to be seen, not enough to be displayed, and the effect was immediate. The murmurs faltered, the woman's words cut off mid-breath, the entire room recalibrating once more around a gesture that required no explanation. Clara felt the contact more clearly now, the warmth of his hand through the glove, the steadiness of it, and for the first time since this had begun, her own movement stilled completely, not because she was being restrained, but because she chose not to pull away. The realization settled quietly, but it settled, and with it came a shift in the way she held herself, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. The Duke lowered her hand again, not releasing it, simply returning it to its previous position, as if the moment had served its purpose and required no further emphasis. Then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying through the room with the same effortless control as before. "I am not selecting from a display," he said, the words simple, but they landed with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. Clara felt the impact of them ripple outward, felt the way the line of carefully arranged candidates seemed to falter, not visibly, not in any way that would be acknowledged, but in the subtle shift of posture, the tightening of hands, the slight delay in breath, and in that moment, the hierarchy that had defined the evening cracked just enough to reveal something beneath it, something less certain, less fixed. Her aunt did not speak immediately this time, the calculation behind her expression deepening, adjusting, searching for a response that would restore balance without openly challenging the authority in front of her. And Clara stood there, at the center of it all, no longer invisible, no longer easily moved aside, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room and, for the first time, not stepping away from it. The words did not settle quietly. They shifted something fundamental, and Clara felt it in the way the room seemed to draw tighter around them, as if the air itself had been pulled inward to witness what would come next. No one spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one was certain who was still allowed to speak, and in that uncertainty, The Duke moved again, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate control that had defined every action since he entered. His hand finally released her wrist, not as a dismissal, not as a retreat, but as a transition, and for a brief second the absence of his touch felt louder than the contact had been. Clara's fingers remained still at her side. The space where his hand had been now strangely present in her awareness, as if it had left something behind that had not yet faded. He stepped past her then, just one measured pace forward, placing himself between her and the center of the ballroom, and in doing so, he did not remove her from the moment. He redefined her position within it, because now she stood just behind him, not hidden, not diminished, but framed by his presence in a way that made it impossible for the room to look at him without also seeing her. The effect was immediate, attention recalibrated, lines of sight adjusted, and Clara felt the shift in how she was being perceived, not as someone out of place, but as someone placed, deliberately, and that distinction settled into her posture before she could question it. Her shoulders aligned, her chin lifted a fraction, not in defiance, but in response to the space that had been created for her. Across the room, the woman who had spoken before took another step forward, her composure intact but her patience thinning beneath it. "Your Grace," she said, the title sharper now, more insistent. "This evening was arranged with the understanding that you would consider the families present." Her gaze flicked toward the line of young women, their stillness now strained, their carefully practiced expressions holding with visible effort. "To disregard that understanding is to place us all in an impossible position." The words were measured, controlled, but they carried weight, the kind that was meant to remind him of expectations without openly challenging his authority. Clara felt the pressure of that argument settle into the space around them, not directed at her, but encompassing her all the same, because she was now the point of deviation, the reason the balance had been disrupted, and for a moment the instinct to step back returned again, quieter this time, more distant, but still present. Her foot shifted slightly, the smallest adjustment, as if testing whether the option to retreat still existed, and then he moved again, not turning fully, not facing her directly, but extending his hand back toward her without looking, the gesture precise, unhesitating, and for a fraction of a second everything seemed to pause, the line of his arm, the angle of his hand, the expectation contained within it. Clara's breath caught, not sharply, but steadily, as she looked at the offered hand, at the space between them that had once been defined by absence and was now defined by choice. She did not move immediately, the hesitation real, the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against her awareness, reminding her of what this would mean, of how it would be seen, interpreted, remembered, and yet the hand remained there, unchanged, unwavering, not urging, not withdrawing, simply waiting, and in that stillness, the decision became hers, not dictated, not forced, and that realization settled deeper than anything else had. Her fingers lifted slowly, the motion controlled, deliberate, and when her hand met his, the contact was quiet, almost unremarkable in its gentleness. But the effect was immediate. The room shifted again, not with surprise this time, but with something closer to recognition, because now the gesture had been completed, now the alignment had been confirmed. He closed his hand around hers, not tightly, not possessively, but with a certainty that left no space for ambiguity. And then, without raising his voice, without altering his tone, he spoke again. "Then consider this my answer," he said, and the simplicity of it cut through every argument that had been forming, every expectation that had been waiting to reassert itself. Clara felt the words settle into the room, felt the way they redirected the tension, not resolving it, but anchoring it in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Behind them, the murmurs returned, quieter than before, but more persistent, a low undercurrent that suggested the room was no longer trying to restore order, it was trying to understand a new one. Her aunt stepped forward once more, closer than she had been willing to come since the Duke had intervened, her composure intact but her urgency no longer entirely concealed. "Clara," she said, her voice lower now, meant only for her, but carrying enough to be heard by those nearest, "you do not understand what you are doing." The words were not cruel, not openly, but they carried a familiar weight, the kind that had always been used to guide, to correct, to keep her within the boundaries that had been set for her long before she had the chance to question them. Clara felt the pull of it, the instinct to listen, to comply, to step back. Into the role that had always been safer, quieter, more predictable. Her fingers tightened slightly in the Duke's hand, not as a signal, not consciously, but enough to register the tension she had not yet resolved. And for a moment, everything seemed to hold again. The space between expectation and action stretched thin, waiting, and then the Duke turned. Finally, fully this time, his gaze moving from the room back to Clara, not questioning, not instructing, simply meeting her where she stood, and in that look there was no dismissal, no doubt, only a calm, unwavering certainty that made everything else feel distant, secondary. And Clara realized, with a clarity that settled deeper than fear, deeper than uncertainty, that whatever happened next would not return her to where she had been, because that place no longer existed in the same way. Not after this, not after him. And the music, which had been waiting in silence for permission to begin again, remained unplayed, as if even the orchestra understood that this moment had not yet reached its end. Her aunt's words did not fade. They lingered, pressing gently but persistently against Clara's awareness, not loud enough to dominate the moment, but present enough to remind her of everything she was expected to be, everything she had always been told she was not allowed to become. And for a second her fingers tightened in his hand again, the movement small but unmistakable, as if the past and the present had collided in that single point of contact, and neither was willing to release her. Completely, the Duke felt it. She knew he did, not because he reacted visibly, but because his grip adjusted in response, not stronger, not restraining, simply steadier, as if acknowledging the tension without drawing attention to it. And that quiet response settled something inside her that had been shifting too quickly to hold. Across the room the murmurs grew more defined, no longer a vague undercurrent, but distinct threads of conversation weaving through the silence, names being exchanged, assumptions being made, interpretations forming before the moment had even reached its conclusion. Clara could feel those unseen judgments moving through the space like a current, brushing against her from every direction, measuring, questioning, recalculating her place in a structure that had never been designed to include her, and still she did not step back. The option remained. She could feel it, a simple movement, a single step that would return everything to something more familiar, more manageable. But her feet remained where they were, anchored not by force, but by the realization that stepping back now would not restore what had been. It would only confirm what others had always believed about her. And that understanding settled deeper than any instruction she had ever been given. The Duke moved again then, not away from her, not releasing her hand, but guiding her forward with a motion so subtle it might have been mistaken for coincidence. A half step, no more. Yet the effect was immediate. The center of the room shifted toward them. The space that had once belonged to carefully arranged candidates now recalibrated around a single, unplanned alignment. Clara felt the movement in her body before she fully understood it. The way her balance adjusted, the way her shoulders squared without conscious effort, the way her gaze lifted just enough to meet the level of those who had always looked past her. And for a brief second, everything seemed to slow again. The room holding its breath as if waiting to see whether she would falter, whether she would remember her place and retreat. But she did not. The step completed, the position held, and in that stillness the shift became visible, not dramatic, not declared, but undeniable. A redistribution of attention, of weight, of expectation. The woman who had spoken earlier took another step forward, closer now. Her composure still intact, but her patience thinning into something sharper. "This cannot continue," she said, her voice low but carrying. The words directed at the Duke, but encompassing Clara all the same. "You place her in a position she does not understand." The implication settled heavily, not cruelly, but with a certainty that suggested Clara's lack of awareness was a fact rather than an assumption. Clara felt the words land, felt the familiar pressure of being defined by others' expectations, and for a moment the doubt returned, quiet but persistent, questioning whether she truly understood what was happening, whether she was stepping into something she could not hold. Her grip shifted slightly again, not pulling away, not tightening, simply adjusting as if testing the reality of the moment against the weight of that doubt. The Duke did not look at the woman when she spoke. His attention remained on Clara, steady, unbroken, and that in itself was an answer, not given in words, but in the refusal to redirect his focus. Then, slowly, he turned his hand, guiding hers upward just enough to bring it into the light. The gesture, controlled, deliberate, and for a fraction of a second everything froze again. The angle of their hands, the way the chandelier light caught the faint mark where the thread had pricked her skin earlier, the smallest detail made visible to a room that had never thought to notice it before. Clara felt the shift in attention as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, the room narrowing, focusing, not on her dress, not on her status, but on something smaller, more precise, something that could not be dismissed as easily as everything else had been. The Duke's voice came then, quiet, measured. "She understands enough," he said, and the simplicity of it cut through the layered arguments that had been building, not dismissing them entirely, but rendering them secondary to something he had already decided. Clara felt the words settle into her, not as reassurance, not exactly, but as a recognition that did not depend on approval or permission, and for the first time since this had begun, the weight of the room shifted slightly off her shoulders, not gone, not diminished, but no longer pressing in the same way, because it was no longer the only force defining her position. Her aunt stepped forward again, closer than before, her composure now edged with something she could not fully conceal. "Clara," she said, her voice firmer this time. Not just a warning, but a directive. "You will step back." The command was clear, controlled, and for a second the old instinct surged forward, stronger than before, urging compliance, urging safety, urging a return to the place where she had always been allowed to exist without consequence. Clara's body reacted before her mind could fully catch up. A slight shift in her weight, a subtle preparation to move, and then the Duke's hand moved again, not pulling her forward this time, not holding her in place, but turning slightly, positioning himself so that any step back would place her behind him rather than away from him. The motion small, almost imperceptible, yet it changed everything, because now retreat no longer meant escape, it meant alignment. And in that realization the choice altered, no longer between staying and leaving, but between how she would remain. Clara felt the shift settle, the clarity of it cutting through the last of her hesitation, and she stilled completely, not stepping back, not stepping forward, simply holding her ground beside him. And in that stillness, in that refusal to be moved by anything other than her own decision, the power dynamic shifted again, not loudly, not with any visible declaration, but with a certainty that no one in the room could ignore, because for the first time, she had chosen not to disappear. The refusal did not settle gently. It struck something deeper, something that had been holding the entire room in a fragile balance, and Clara felt it break, not loudly, not with any single sound, but through a series of small, precise shifts that spread outward from where she stood. A fan snapped shut too quickly, a heel turned too sharply against the marble, a breath drawn in and not released, and for the first time since the Duke had entered, the tension stopped pretending to be contained. It rose, visible now, undeniable, pressing against every carefully maintained expression in the room. Her aunt stepped forward again, closer than she had come before, the distance between them narrowing to something that could no longer be ignored, her hand lifting once more, not tentative this time, but certain, reaching for Clara's arm with the authority of someone who had always been obeyed. And for a fraction of a second, everything seemed to freeze, the angle of her hand, the space it crossed. The moment just before contact, Clara felt it as clearly as if time itself had paused to ask a question she had never been allowed to answer. Her body reacted instinctively, not stepping back, not retreating, but holding still, her gaze steady, her breath controlled. And just as her aunt's fingers were about to close around her sleeve, the Duke moved, not quickly, not forcefully, but with a precision that made the interruption absolute. His hand lifted, intercepting the motion without touching it directly. The space between their hands reduced to nothing but intention, and the effect was immediate. Her aunt's movement stopped, suspended midair, her composure faltering for the Briefest moment as the gesture was denied without a single word. The room reacted in silence, the kind of silence that carried more weight than any outcry could have. Clara felt it press against her from every direction. The realization that this was no longer subtle, no longer something that could be explained away as curiosity or oversight. This was a refusal, clear and deliberate, and she was at the center of it. Her aunt lowered her hand slowly, the control returning, but the fracture remained, visible now in the slight tightening of her expression. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice low, measured, but no longer softened for the sake of appearance. "You are placing her in a situation she cannot navigate." The words were directed at the Duke, but they landed against Clara with equal force, defining her once again as something unprepared, something insufficient, and for a moment the doubt surged back, stronger than before, sharper, questioning everything that had brought her to this point. Her fingers shifted slightly, the smallest movement, as if testing whether she could still withdraw before this became irreversible. And then the Duke's hand moved again, not toward her this time, but past her, reaching just far enough to take hold of the fabric she had set aside earlier, the torn seam she had been repairing, the motion unexpected, deliberate. And for a second the entire room seemed to hold its breath as he lifted it, the pale silk catching the chandelier light, the faint line of stitching visible, the small, imperfect mark where her hand had worked to restore something no one else had noticed was broken. Clara felt the shift in attention immediately, the room narrowing again, not to her face, not to her position, but to the object in his hand, the proof of something quiet, something easily overlooked, and he held it there, not high, not displayed, simply present. And then he spoke, his voice calm, steady. "She repairs what you overlook," he said, the words simple, but they landed with a precision that cut through the layered arguments that had been building, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Clara felt the impact of it settle into her, not as praise, not as something she had been waiting to hear, but as a recognition that did not depend on approval. And around them the room shifted again, the murmurs changing tone, no longer questioning whether she belonged, but trying to understand why she had been seen in a way no one else had considered. Her aunt's expression tightened further, the control still present but the certainty beneath it beginning to fracture. "That is not what is being decided here," she said, her voice sharper. Now, the edge no longer concealed. "This is about standing, about family, about what is appropriate." Each word placed carefully, deliberately, as if reinforcing the structure she was trying to preserve. Clara felt the weight of those words settle around her, the familiar hierarchy pressing in again, reminding her of every boundary she had been taught to respect, every limit she had learned not to cross. And for a moment it felt as though the room itself was leaning forward, waiting to see which of those truths would hold, the one that had always defined her, or the one that had just been spoken into existence. The Duke lowered the fabric slightly, his attention returning to Clara, not questioning, not instructing, simply meeting her where she stood. And in that look there was no hesitation, no reconsideration, only a calm, unwavering certainty that made everything else feel distant, secondary. And then he stepped closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to shift the balance once more, his presence redefining the space around her again. And for a brief second everything seemed to slow, the room suspended between what had been and what was about to be decided. Clara felt her breath steady, her posture align, the earlier uncertainty settling into something quieter, something more grounded. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, controlled, but clear enough to carry. "I understand enough to stand here," she said, the words simple, but they did not tremble, they did not retreat. And in that moment, the silence that followed was not uncertain, it was charged, the kind that comes just before something shifts in a way that cannot be undone, and no one moved to stop it. The words did not echo, they settled. And that was what changed everything, because once they settled, they could not be taken back. Clara felt it in the way the room reacted, not with immediate outrage, not with visible disruption, but with something quieter and far more dangerous, recognition, the kind that shifts a moment from uncertain to undeniable. Her voice still lingered in the air, soft but steady. And for a fraction of a second no one moved, not her aunt, not the woman who had challenged the Duke, not even the line of carefully presented daughters who now stood with expressions that had begun to fracture beneath the strain of what they were witnessing. The Duke did not speak immediately. He did not need to. His presence alone held the moment in place. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered the piece of fabric in his hand and set it aside on a nearby table. The motion controlled, final, as if placing something down that would not be picked up again. And when he turned back to Clara, the space between them shifted once more, no longer defined by interruption or defense, but by something quieter, something that suggested decision. His hand lifted, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with that same precise intention that had guided every movement. And for a brief second, everything seemed to freeze again. The angle of his arm, the stillness of his posture, the way the light caught the edge of his glove as it hovered just within her reach. Clara felt the weight of it, not as pressure, but as possibility. The room leaning in around them, every gaze drawn to that single point where something irreversible was about to happen. Her breath steadied, not because she was calm, but because she understood that whatever came next would not allow for hesitation. And when her hand met his again, the contact was immediate, certain, and in that instant the balance of the room shifted with a clarity that left no room for denial. The Duke did not release her this time. He did not adjust or reposition. He simply held her hand and turned, guiding her forward, not away from the center, but directly into it. The movement slow enough to be deliberate, clear, enough to be seen, and the effect was immediate. The crowd parted, not dramatically, not with any outward display, but with the quiet efficiency of people who understood when something had been decided beyond their influence. Clara felt the movement beneath her feet. The way the marbles seemed different now, not colder, not harder, but more real, as if each step carried weight she had never been allowed to place before. And still the room watched, the silence no longer uncertain, but charged. Waiting, her aunt moved again, faster this time, the control slipping just enough to reveal urgency beneath it. "This is not how this is done," she said, her voice low but sharp, the words cutting through the stillness. "You cannot simply." She stopped, not because she had finished, but because the Duke had turned his head, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge her, and in that small movement, everything she had been about to say lost its place. His gaze held hers for a fraction of a second, not challenging, not dismissive, simply present, and that was enough. Her words did not continue, the interruption complete without a single spoken command. Clara felt the shift again, the way authority moved through the room without needing to be declared, and for the first time since this had begun, the opposition faltered, not completely, not yet, but enough to be felt. The Duke continued forward, guiding Clara into the open space where the dance floor began, the polished surface stretching out before them, empty now, waiting, the orchestra still silent, their instruments poised but untouched, as if even they understood that the next movement would not follow any pattern they had been given. Clara felt the space open around her, the distance between her and the others widening, not isolating, but defining, and with it came a shift inside her, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, a quiet alignment between where she stood and how she held herself there. Her fingers rested in his without tension now, the earlier uncertainty replaced by something more grounded, something that did not require her to question whether she belonged in this moment, because the moment itself had already made that decision. Behind them, the murmurs rose again, sharper now, less controlled, the room no longer able to contain the implications of what was unfolding. But no one stepped forward to stop it. No one moved to intervene, because there was nothing left to argue against, not in a way that would change what had already been set in motion. The Duke stopped then, at the center of the floor, the exact point where every eye in the room could see them without obstruction, and for a brief second, everything stilled, the air, the movement, the quiet hum of expectation that had been building since the moment he entered. Clara felt it settle around her, not as pressure, but as presence, the kind that demanded attention without asking for it. And then, without raising his voice, without signaling to the orchestra, he spoke. "Begin," he said, and the word landed with a certainty that did not require confirmation. The musicians responded instantly, as if they had been waiting for that single Permission, the first note rising into the air, clear, controlled, filling the space that had been held in silence for far too long. Clara felt the shift as the music returned, the rhythm settling into the room. But nothing else returned with it. Not the old order, not the careful arrangements. Those had been left behind somewhere in the silence that had preceded this moment. And as the Duke's hand adjusted in hers, guiding her into the first movement of a dance that had never been planned, Clara understood, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that there was no longer a place for her to return to, because the place she had come from no longer existed in the same way, not after this. Not after being seen, not after choosing to remain when everything had told her to disappear, and the room, watching, silent despite the music, knew it too. The first step did not belong to her, it belonged to him, and Clara felt it before she fully understood it, the subtle shift of his hand guiding hers, the precise angle of his body turning just enough to set the direction, and then the world moved with it, the music swelling around them as if it had been waiting for this exact alignment, the rhythm steady, controlled, undeniable, and for a moment everything else disappeared. Not the people, not the room, but the weight of them, the judgment, the expectation, the years of being told where she belonged. All of it receded just enough to allow something else to take its place, something quieter, something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to clarity. His hand at her waist was firm but not restrictive, his touch measured, intentional, and when he drew her into the first turn, the motion was smooth, effortless, as if she had always known how to follow it, as if her body recognized a pattern her mind had never been taught. The floor beneath her feet felt different now, not distant, not something she moved across unnoticed, but something she claimed with each step, each turn, each controlled breath, and around them the room watched, the silence beneath the music louder than anything else, because no one was speaking now, not even in whispers. The moment had passed beyond commentary, beyond quiet judgment. It had become something that demanded attention without allowing interruption. Clara felt it in the way every movement seemed sharper, clearer, the space around them defined by the absence of anything that could disrupt what was unfolding. And then he spoke, not loudly, not in a way meant for anyone else, but close enough that she felt the words before she heard them. "You do not move like someone who was not meant to stand here," he said, and the statement settled into her with a weight she had not expected, not as praise, not as surprise, but as a quiet recognition that reached deeper than anything. Spoken in the room so far, her breath caught, just slightly, the rhythm of the dance continuing without pause, her hand steady in his, her posture aligned in a way that no longer felt borrowed, but chosen, and for a moment she forgot the room entirely, forgot the eyes, the expectations, the structure that had always defined her place within it, until a voice cut through the music, not loud, but sharp enough to break the illusion. "Stop this at once," her aunt's voice, controlled but no longer composed, the words carrying across the floor with a clarity that no one could ignore, and just like that, the room returned, the weight of it pressing back in, the presence of every watching gaze settling once more around them. The Duke did not stop, not immediately, his movement continuing for one more measured turn, one more controlled step, as if allowing the interruption to exist without granting it authority. And then, slowly, deliberately, he brought the dance to a halt, not abruptly, not in a way that suggested compliance, but in a manner that felt like completion, as if he had chosen the exact moment to end it rather than being forced to do so. Clara felt the shift as they stopped, the stillness settling around them again, the music faltering, then cutting off entirely as the musicians realized that the rhythm no longer had a place to continue. And in that silence, everything that had been held back surged forward. Her aunt stepped onto the floor now, no longer observing from the edge, no longer contained within the structure of polite distance, her presence immediate, undeniable. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice low but carrying, each word placed with a precision that suggested finality. "You cannot take a girl with no standing, no name worth noting, and place her at the center of a decision that affects every family here." The words landed with force, not shouted, not exaggerated, but clear, defined, leaving no space for misinterpretation. Clara felt them strike, not because they were new, but because They were now being spoken in a space where she could not pretend not to hear them. The truth of her position laid bare in front of everyone who mattered. Her fingers tightened slightly in his hand. The movement small, involuntary, as if her body had reacted before she could decide how to respond. And then he moved again, not stepping away, not releasing her, but turning, fully this time, to face her aunt, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, and for a moment the two of them stood in direct opposition, not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through something far more precise. Authority meeting expectation, decision meeting resistance, and the room held its breath. Because this was no longer about a single choice, it was about whether that choice would be allowed to stand. The Duke's voice came then, calm, measured, carrying without effort. "You believe her to be without standing," he said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating the assumption that had governed every word spoken so far. Her aunt did not hesitate. "It is not belief, it is fact," she replied, her tone steady, certain, reinforced by years of structure that had never been questioned in rooms like this. And for a moment it seemed as though the weight of that certainty might hold, might restore the balance that had been disrupted. Clara felt it press in again, the familiar shape of expectation, the quiet insistence that she should step back, that she should allow the moment to correct itself before it became something irreversible. Her breath steadied, her posture held, but the doubt was there, present, persistent. And then the Duke did something no one expected. His hand released hers, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with a deliberate precision that made the absence of contact feel like its own kind of statement. And before Clara could react, before the room could interpret what that meant, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, the motion controlled, unhurried, and for a fraction of a second everything froze again, the movement isolated, the anticipation sharp, every eye fixed on the space between his hand and the fabric of his coat. And when he withdrew it, he held something small, something that caught the light just enough to be seen but not yet understood, a signet, unmistakable in its design, its crest known, recognized, carrying weight that extended far beyond the room they stood in. And he did not present it dramatically. He did not raise it high or announce its significance. He simply held it between them, visible, undeniable. And then he spoke, his voice unchanged, as if the revelation required no emphasis. "She was under my protection before she entered this room," he said, the words quiet, controlled, but they landed with a force that shattered every assumption that had been built around her. Clara felt it, as if the ground beneath her had shifted, not violently, not suddenly, but completely, the narrative that had defined her position dissolving in an instant, replaced by something no one had considered, something no one had been prepared to challenge. The room reacted, not with immediate sound, but with a silence so complete it felt like absence, the kind that follows when something irreversible has been revealed. And in that silence, Clara understood that the power in the room had not just shifted, it had been redefined. Entirely. The silence did not break when the signet was revealed. It deepened, sharpened, as if the room itself had drawn a breath it no longer knew how to release. Clara felt it settle into every corner of the ballroom, into every rigid posture, every fixed gaze, every carefully composed expression that now struggled to hold its shape. The crest was unmistakable, even to those who had only seen it in letters or heard it spoken in distant conversations. And now it was here, held between them with a quiet certainty that left no space for doubt. Her aunt did not speak immediately, and that alone was enough to mark the shift, because she had always spoken first, always filled the space before uncertainty could take hold. But now there was hesitation, visible, undeniable, her eyes fixed on the signet, her composure recalculating in real time, and Clara stood at the center of it, the weight of the revelation settling into her with a clarity that felt almost unreal. She had known he was powerful. She had felt it in the way the room had responded to him. But this was something else, something deliberate, something that reached backward in time and rewrote the way every moment leading up to this one had been understood. The Duke lowered his hand slightly, not hiding the signet, not displaying it further, simply allowing it to exist without emphasis. And then he stepped closer, closing the distance between himself and Clara in a way that felt less like movement and more like alignment. His presence steady, unshaken by the tension that now filled the room. Her aunt found her voice then, but it came slower, more controlled. Each word placed with care, as if testing whether it would hold. "If this is meant to suggest some prior arrangement," she said, her tone measured, "then it should have been disclosed before this evening began." The argument was precise, constructed to regain footing without openly challenging what had been revealed, but the certainty behind it had changed, softened at the edges. Clara felt the difference immediately. The way the authority in her aunt's voice no longer pressed against her in the same way, no longer carried the same unquestioned weight. And that realization settled into her posture, subtle but undeniable. Her shoulders remained aligned, her gaze steady, not lowered, not retreating, and for the first time since this had begun, she did not feel the instinct to disappear under the force of someone else's certainty. The Duke did not respond at once. His attention shifted briefly to the room, not scanning, not seeking approval, simply acknowledging the presence of those who had been watching, and then it returned to Clara, as if reaffirming that she remained the center of his decision. His hand moved again, not to reclaim hers immediately, but to gesture slightly, indicating the space beside him, and for a fraction of a second everything seemed to freeze, the invitation clear, the expectation unspoken but unmistakable. Clara felt the weight of it, not as pressure, but as choice. The room waiting, her aunt watching. The entire structure of expectation poised on the edge of what she would do next, and she moved, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a controlled certainty that surprised even her, stepping into the space he had indicated, aligning herself beside him without needing to be guided. And in that movement, the last illusion of her previous position dissolved. She was no longer being placed, she was choosing where she stood, and the room saw it, felt it, adjusted to it. The Duke's hand returned then, closing around hers once more, not as a correction, but as a confirmation, and this time the contact felt different, not new, not unfamiliar, but grounded in something that had already been decided. Her aunt took a step back, the motion small but significant, the first physical acknowledgement that the balance had shifted beyond her control. The woman who had spoken earlier did not step forward again, her silence now carrying a different weight, not resistance, but recognition, and Clara felt it, the change in how she was being seen, not entirely accepted, not yet, but no longer dismissed, no longer reduced to something that could be corrected or removed. The Duke spoke then, his voice calm, unhurried. "You arranged an evening for me to choose," he said, not addressing any one person, but the room as a whole. "I have done so." The words were simple, but they landed with a finality that no argument could easily dismantle. Clara felt them settle into the space around her, felt the way they closed the distance between uncertainty and decision. Her aunt's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, to challenge, to reassert something that might still hold, but no words came, because there was nothing left that could be said without directly opposing what had already been established, and that, in this room, in this moment, was a line no one was prepared to cross. The Duke turned then, not away from her, but slightly toward her, his gaze meeting hers fully, not assessing, not questioning, simply present, and for a brief second the room receded again, the noise, the pressure, the expectations fading into something distant, and in that space, Clara understood the full weight of what had happened, not just the shift in how she was being seen, but the shift in how she saw herself. Within it, the years of being told she was secondary, replaceable, unseen, did not disappear, but they no longer defined the limits of where she could stand, because she was standing here now, and no one had been able to move her from it. The Duke's hand tightened slightly around hers, not enough to restrain, just enough to ground, and then he turned back to the room, the movement deliberate, controlled, and in that turn, the final alignment settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that carried through every gaze, every thought, every quiet realization forming in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Clara stood beside him, not behind, not apart, and the room, for all its history, for all its structure, could do nothing but accept that she was no longer invisible. No one moved to stop it. And that was the true resolution, not in words, not in declarations, but in the absence of resistance. Clara felt it settle into the room like a final note that did not need to be repeated, the silence no longer sharp, no longer strained, but heavy with acceptance, not approval, not yet, but something that carried the same weight. The Duke did not release her hand, and that continuity mattered more than anything that had been said, because it did not allow the moment to fragment into something temporary. It held, steady and unbroken. His posture remained unchanged, composed, deliberate, but there was a subtle shift in the way he stood beside her, less a barrier now, less a force holding the room at a distance, and more an alignment that placed her within it on equal footing. Clara felt the difference immediately. The space around her no longer something she had to navigate carefully, but something that adjusted to her presence without resistance. The line of young women at the far end of the ballroom had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be seen. Their formation no longer precise, their attention no longer directed forward with certainty, but drawn instead toward the center where she stood. And in that shift, the hierarchy that had defined the evening dissolved into something less rigid, less certain. Her aunt remained where she was, no longer advancing, no longer correcting. Her composure restored but altered, the confidence that had once directed every movement now tempered by something quieter, something that acknowledged a boundary she could not cross. Clara met her gaze for a brief moment, not defiant, not challenging, simply present. And in that look there was no apology, no retreat, only the quiet acknowledgement that something had changed between them in a way that could not be undone. The Duke moved then, not away from her, but slightly forward, guiding her with him, not toward the exit, not toward the edge, but along the length of the ballroom, the movement unhurried, deliberate, and as they walked, the room responded, not with grand gestures, not with formal bows or acknowledgments, but with the subtle, unmistakable adjustments of space. People stepping aside, conversations falling silent as they passed, attention shifting to follow their movement without needing to be directed. Clara felt each step differently now. The marble beneath her feet no longer distant, no longer something she crossed unnoticed, but something that carried her forward with a weight she could feel, each movement grounded, each breath measured. The earlier uncertainty replaced by a steadiness that did not rely on permission. They reached the far end of the ballroom where the tall windows stood, the glass reflecting the chandeliers above, the light catching in a way that blurred the line between what was real and what was reflected. And for a moment they stopped, not because they had reached a destination, but because the movement itself had served its purpose. The Duke turned slightly, his gaze moving over the room once more, not assessing, not claiming, simply acknowledging the shift that had taken place within it. And then it returned to her. And in that look, there was something quieter than before, less about decision, less about assertion, and more about recognition, as if the moment between them no longer needed to prove itself to anyone else. Clara felt it settle into her, not as relief, not as something that resolved everything that had come before, but as a clarity that did not require explanation. Her hand remained in his, the contact steady, unchanged, and for the first time since this had begun, she became aware of it without tension, without the need to question what it meant or how it would be seen. It simply was, and that was enough. The room behind them did not return to what it had been. The music resumed, but it carried a different tone, a different rhythm, as if the structure it followed had been altered in a way that could not be reversed. Conversations began again, quieter, more measured, each one shaped by the understanding that what had happened would not be forgotten. Clara turned her gaze toward the windows, toward the reflection that showed her standing there, not at the edge, not hidden, behind movement and expectation, but clearly visible, aligned with a presence that had changed the way the entire room moved around her. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to still again. The reflection holding steady, the image clear, as if offering her a chance to see herself in a way she never had before, not as someone defined by absence, but as someone defined by where she chose to stand. The Duke's hand shifted slightly, not pulling, not guiding, just enough to draw her attention back from the reflection. And when she looked at him, the space between them felt different, not charged in the same way, not filled with the same tension, but still carrying something unresolved, something that had not yet reached its end, and she understood, without needing to be told, that this moment, for all its clarity, for all its finality within the room, was only the beginning of something that would extend far beyond it. The room had adjusted, the power had shifted, but the consequences of that shift had not yet fully revealed themselves. And as they stood there, the silence that remained between them was no longer uncertain, but it was not complete either. It held, steady and quiet, waiting for what would come next. The reflection did not move when she did, and for a moment Clara thought it might remain like that forever, suspended between what had been and what had become. The ballroom behind her softened by light, the figures blurred just enough to make them distant, less immediate, less defining. And in that glass she saw herself not as she had entered, not as the girl kneeling on cold marble with thread in her hands and silence wrapped around her like something expected, but as she stood now, upright, aligned, her hand still held in his, her place no longer uncertain. The Duke shifted beside her, not stepping away, not releasing her, but turning slightly so that the reflection caught both of them fully, the angle deliberate, the image complete, and for a fraction of a second everything seemed to freeze again, the chandeliers suspended above them, the music behind them fading into something distant, the entire room reduced to that single frame, and in it, nothing looked accidental, nothing looked misplaced. Clara felt it settle into her, not as something borrowed, not as something fragile, but as something that had already taken root. The Duke's hand moved then, not to guide, not to direct, but to lift hers just slightly, enough to draw her attention back from the reflection to the present. His voice came quietly, not meant for the room, not meant for anyone else. "You stayed," he said, the words simple, but they carried weight, not as a question, not as a test, but as a recognition that did not require explanation. Clara felt the truth of it settle deeper than anything that had been said before, because staying had not been a single decision. It had been a series of them, each one made in silence, each one made against everything she had been taught to expect. Her fingers tightened slightly in his, not out of uncertainty, but out of something steadier, something that did not need to be named to be understood. She turned her gaze from the reflection back to him, meeting his eyes fully, not lowering her gaze, not adjusting her posture to fit what the room might still expect, simply standing as she was. And in that moment, the last trace of hesitation dissolved, not dramatically, not all at once, but completely. The room behind them began to move again. Conversations resumed, quieter, more careful, as if shaped by the awareness that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. But no one approached, no one interrupted. The space around them remained intact, not because it was enforced, but because it was understood. The Duke released her hand then, not abruptly, not as a withdrawal, but with the same precision that had defined every movement between them. And for a brief second the absence of his touch felt different than before, not like a loss, but like a transition. Clara's hand remained where it was, lifted slightly, the space between them no longer defined by contact, but by something quieter, something that held without needing to be held. He stepped back half a pace, just enough to give her room, not to separate, but to allow her to stand without being framed by his presence. And that, more than anything, confirmed the shift, because now she was not standing beside him to be seen. She was standing on her own and still being seen. The distinction settled into the room with a clarity that no one could ignore. Clara turned slightly, her gaze moving across the ballroom, not searching, not measuring, simply acknowledging what had once defined her place within it. The line of young women, the careful arrangements, the quiet expectations, all of it still there, unchanged in form, but altered in meaning, because now she stood outside of it, not excluded, not overlooked, but separate in a way that redefined the structure itself. Her aunt remained at the edge of the floor, her posture composed, her expression controlled, but there was something different in the way she held herself now, a recognition that did not come easily, but had settled nonetheless. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no correction in her gaze, no silent instruction, only a quiet acknowledgement of what could no longer be undone. Clara held that look for a moment, not defiant, not seeking approval, simply present, and then she looked away, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. The Duke moved again, stepping closer once more, not reclaiming the space he had given, but aligning with it. His presence beside her no longer something that defined her position, but something that existed alongside it. His hand lifted slightly, not reaching for hers this time, but offering something else, something smaller, more precise. And when she looked, she saw it, the signet, held between his fingers, its crest catching the light in a way that made it unmistakable. He did not speak immediately, did not explain, simply held it there, the gesture quiet, deliberate. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow again. The space between them defined by that single object, by what it represented, by what it could mean beyond this room. Clara felt the weight of it, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as possibility, the kind that extended beyond the boundaries of the ballroom, beyond the eyes that still watched, beyond the structure that had just been reshaped around her. Her breath steadied, her gaze remained fixed, and then, slowly, she lifted her hand, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the same controlled certainty that had carried her through every moment before this. Her fingers closed around the signet, the contact brief, precise, and in that instant, everything stilled once more, not because the room had stopped, but because something within it had reached its end, and its beginning, at the same time. The Duke's hand withdrew, leaving the signet in hers, and he did not take it back, did not explain, did not claim what it meant. He simply watched, his gaze steady, unbroken, and in that silence,